Good day to thee. It is such a bountiful day, and thou art so wonderful, that we're going to study art and architecture of the 15 and 1600s. You'll start with your notes, and you'll copy some things down, and then truly it's a picture show. So at the end, just sit back and enjoy the beautiful architecture from around the world and the Baroque music. So let's begin. We have two styles of art in this test, and this is kind of our last segment for Chapter 7. We have Mannerism art. And if you remember, Mannerism art was an Italian movement in the 1500s. They deliberately ignore balance, harmony, and proportion on purpose. They show elongated figures because they figured the longer the body, the more emotion you would feel, I guess. So if you'll take a look at this lovely lady over here, notice how long her torso is. Look at her neck, how long it is. It's out of proportion with the rest of her body. That's what we're talking about. If you look at the baby here, almost looks like an alien from some sci-fi movie, doesn't it? Again, it's showing a disproportionate body to what's normal. Some other things to look for. That's the number one thing to look for. And if you look for that weird, out of proportion body, you'll know it. If you've ever been to like a fun house and you go into the mirror room, you know that mirror that lengthens your body? That's basically what Mannerism art is, okay? Now, a couple of things that were popular during this era, they used a lot of like stormy yellow and kind of like a pea green, 70s carpet green. So you'll see some of those colors in our paintings. You'll see very stylized poses. And what I mean by that is they're very fake. You can tell that they're just posed for the picture. For example, anybody who's held a baby before knows that this would not be the way to hold a baby. If you held a baby like this, what would happen? The baby would roll out onto the floor, right? So that's what we mean by a very stylized pose. And that's kind of basically all you need to look for Mannerism. Here's one example here, Madonna with the long neck, by Parmigianino. El Greco is probably one of the most famous Mannerist artists, and I know some of you actually did that for your art replica. Again, notice the long body that you see here. We'll see the greens and yellows that we talked about, and a very stylized pose. Obviously, we don't normally stand or pose that way. Here's an example of English Mannerism. This is Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. Take a look at his long body, his long legs, out of proportion, of course. We also have the greens and the yellowish hues. And, of course, he's posing. There you have it. And that's Mannerism. Now, Mannerism was so strange that people just honestly didn't like it a whole lot, and it didn't last very long. So they moved on to the next style, which really took a huge form, and that is Baroque art. Now, if you look at the word Baroque, that in itself is a clue, because the word Baroque means elaborate or detailed. One of the number one things you'll want to look for Baroque art is there's just a lot going on, like tons going on, almost so much so that it might be a little gaudy, or you can't even tell what the theme of the painting is. So if you'll take a look at this picture over here before we move on, without looking at the bottom, see if you can figure out what this painting is about. Take a look. Lots going on, a lot of characters. If you guessed the birth of the baby Jesus, you're right, it is. But you'll notice that for Baroque art, they put all of these characters all into one little picture instead of maybe just the baby and the mother and the father. So we see a lot of that style right here. Baroque art was part of what we call the Counter-Reformation. Now, if you remember, the Reformation was what was started by Martin Luther, where he started the Protestant movement separated from the Catholic Church. Well, now we're seeing the Counter-Reformation. The Catholic Church has realized they've made some mistakes back in that day, and so they fixed those, and now they want to get people back in the seats. So they start to use some of these paintings in their beautiful cathedrals, and they'll hire artists to paint beautiful murals on the walls or on the ceiling. And the hope is that you'll come and visit and see the painting, and then hopefully stay for Mass. Kings also used Baroque art inside their castles. They wanted to show people these beautiful pieces, and again, they were on the wall, they were frescoes, or they were on the ceiling. Some things to look for, you'll also see exaggerated decorations, colossal sculptures, as in like huge in detail, and obviously all artists are basically trying to get an emotional reaction from you. So that's nothing new. Now, some things that you might want to look for other than being very detailed. It's very less realistic faces. I mean, for example, look at this guy over here. I mean, this is the birth of the baby Jesus. And yet, he's like, birth of baby Jesus. I'm not sure how I feel about this. Very unrealistic faces, as you can see. You'll also see movement as well in some of these paintings, which we've seen going on since the Renaissance. This one, by the way, is called Adoration, and it's done by Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens was a really famous Baroque artist, one of my favorites, actually. This is another one of my favorite painters. This is Caravaggio. It's called The Entombment of Christ, from 1602 to 1603. And you'll notice in this case, our number one feature is missing. We don't see a lot of gaudy detail. So now we've got to go to the other characteristics, which were unrealistic faces and really odd posing, right? Okay, so if you'll take a look, here we're talking about the death of Jesus, and he's going in the tomb. Notice how we have very dramatic reactions to this. Most people in a funeral aren't like, oh my gosh, right? That's not very typical, so they're exaggerating that emotion. And you'll see that it definitely wants to give you that emotional attachment to this picture or reaction. This is one of my all-time favorites. This is done by Caravaggio as well. It's called The Taking of Christ. And again, if you look at this, not a lot of detail. So we're looking at that emotional impact and the exaggerated reaction. So notice how they're all reacting very differently. We see faces, very exaggerated faces. A couple of neat things about this. First of all, this is where we talked about light versus dark being used in the past. Now we're going to actually name it. This is called chiaroscuro. And they want you to focus on something particular in this painting. So they're using light versus dark. So for example, the soldiers that you see here, their uniforms were not black, but they're putting them black on this painting so that something else shows up. So before I tell you what that is, I want you to think about what that is. You actually know the story of this painting, okay? Do you remember when we studied the Last Supper in one of our previous chapters? And we said it was a reaction to Jesus saying, one of you is going to get me killed? This is that moment. This is where one of his best friends, Judas, takes the money, takes the coin from the soldiers, and he agrees to point out Jesus. And the way that he did that was he said that I will kiss Jesus on the cheek so that you know which one he is. And then the soldiers take him away and unfortunately end up killing him, right? Well, this is the famous kiss of death, as they say. So what do you suppose the focus is of the painting? Absolutely. It's this famous kiss that you see right here. Good. Now, just something extra for you. Caravaggio actually put himself in this painting. He's right back here. All right, moving on. Boy, is this a Baroque piece. Lots of detail, right? Lots going on. This one is done by Peter Paul Rubens, and it's called Massacre of the Innocents. It's actually based on a real story in the Bible, so we know that it is a biblical topic. What happened was the kings back in this day had heard about Jesus' birth, and they thought that he was coming to take the throne from them. But they didn't understand that that wasn't the kind of throne they were talking about. And so the king ordered all the soldiers to kill every male baby in this entire region. And you see that's what's going on. It's actually a really graphic painting. You'll see dead babies lying on the ground. Here this guy's going to smash this baby's head in on this pillar. The mothers are defending their children. You see that? She's scratching his cheek, trying to protect him. The swords. It's just amazing. A lot of detail going on. Now let me show you something interesting. Take a look at the next slide. This one was done by Peter Paul Rubens, and it's called Massacre of the Innocents. Believe it or not, this was found in 2002 in an attic. Man, I wish I could find something like this in my attic. But it was sold for $86 million. So it's led art historians to really discuss why did he have two versions? And why the difference? Obviously, there's definitely a difference between the two. It's the same subject, as you can tell. They're massacring babies in this as well. But it's a little different in perspective. You notice this one is zoomed out a little bit more. You'll see there are angels taking away the babies. That's something people like. It takes place in the exact same place. If you'll notice the background here, I'll go back so you can look at it. See how the buildings are the same in the back? So the question is why? You'll notice this one has more nudity, showing the beauty of the human body, like we've talked about in the past. So my question for you that I'd like you to answer is, which one do you think he did first and why? And then secondly, why did he do two versions? Truth is, we'll never know, but I'm curious about what you have to say. So take a moment and pause it here and, other way. And pause it here and then write down your answers. Okay, so that's our painting for this unit. We have two styles, Mannerism and Baroque. Now we're going to talk about architecture, the buildings of this era. And you're going to see we use Baroque architecture during this era. And if you look at this picture right here, you can already tell that there's a similarity between Baroque art and Baroque architecture. What do you suppose it is? Yep. Lots of detail. Remember, the word Baroque means detailed or elaborate. I mean, take a look at this. This isn't like any house I have or any room, right? Every little bit is carved or painted. There's no flat ceiling or flat walls. It's all carved. It's absolutely beautiful. Gaudy, maybe, but beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So let's look at the characteristics. All right, first of all, this started in the 1600s, and it also started in Italy. They used these buildings for the same reasons. They used them for the Counter-Reformation. They built beautiful architecture to try to get people back into the Catholic Church. Kings also used this architecture to awe their visitors and really make them go, wow, they got a lot of money or they're very powerful. We see chiaroscuro in the architecture, where we use light versus dark in a lot of areas. Of course, we've got that gaudy or detailed feature. There's just a lot going on here. But imagine the amount of time it took to do all of this architecture. Lots of ornamentation, and they made ornamentation out of anything they could find. Wood, plaster, stucco. I'm sure if they had plastic back then, they would have used it, but it wasn't invented yet. But lots and lots of detail. Now let's look at some of the things that are different between Baroque art and architecture. We see large frescoes within these beautiful buildings. Lots of gold. And I'm talking real gold, people. Can you imagine the amount of money it took to build these beautiful things? Because again, the king or queen that had the most gold had the most power. Remember, that's why explorers like Cortez and Pizarro brought gold back for their kings, okay? You'll see angels are very popular in this architecture. You'll see some inventions, two new things. We see the invention of windows for the first time, glass windows, and also mirrors had never been invented until this era. So the people that have money are really showing those off. This is the Hall of Mirrors with Louis, all the Louis technically, and they're showing off all this beautiful wealth in the Hall of Mirrors, okay? You'll see for the first time, we start seeing color on the outside of the buildings. They didn't really know how to do that with painting. They only had paint for like paintings. So now you're going to see yellows and greens and blues and all different colors on the outside as well. Size does matter in this era. These castles are huge, just huge. Can you imagine having so many rooms that you never find them all? And there is a true story or two about young children that are in the castle and they actually get lost because there were over 300 rooms in these beautiful castles. So it's quite an amazing feat. And there's one more characteristic, but I need a picture to show it to you. And that is called churrigueresque. Now, churrigueresque is a Spanish style, so we found it mostly in Spain or Mexico. And it's basically ornamentation that's made out of stucco. If you've ever seen stucco houses down south in like Arizona, that's what they're using. And notice all of this detail. This is all stucco. Incredible stuff. So let's look at a couple of examples of churrigueresque. Think of like churro at Taco John's, churrigueresque. Here's one in Taxco. They use churrigueresque all along the spires here, and then all along the front as well. Notice what we mean by kind of gaudy colors. I don't know that we would wear these colors together, ladies, but it's beautiful in its own right, isn't it? The amount of time it took. Wow. This is one of my favorites. This is in Mexico City. Notice they use churrigueresque on the entire front of this building. And you'll notice they've also even carved into the wood here. And notice these people are standing in front of it. So huge doors. Absolutely beautiful. And again, it's a Catholic tabernacle trying to lure people back in after the Reformation. All right, so let's take a look at some of our examples of Baroque architecture. And you'll notice we're going to start with no color on the outside, but we're going to start really making it fancy on the inside. If there is any building that is the most famous for this style, it is the Louvre. Now, what is the Louvre known for today? Yeah, it's a museum. But the museum actually only takes about maybe a third or maybe a half of the building. This used to be Louis XIII's house, if you remember, and now it's been made into a museum on this part. Remember that this was not there back in Louis's day. That's something that's been added more recently in my lifetime. Let's take a look at some of its features, shall we? Notice all of the frescoes on the ceiling, all of the gold accents. What I think surprises people when they go to the Louvre, they expect that the paintings are going to be the beauty, and they are, but it's the building that's also beautiful. And I think people are surprised by that. Notice all the detail along the sides, all the paintings, and the windows as well. This is actually where the crown jewels were held. More architecture on the ceiling, gold accent all the way around all of this. Wow. On the outside, things to look for. We see a lot of detail like this, a lot of architecture detail. We see a lot of statues. In fact, if you look at the next one here, notice that there's statues all the way down on this side and on the upper side. And remember that France has been through 2 world wars. Kind of amazes me that it's in as good a shape as it is. Inside this particular castle, you'll see that Napoleon III's apartment is in part of that building. Take a look at all of the gold. And they're showing off the fact that they can do glass, right? With the chandeliers. Absolutely gorgeous. So let's take a look at Louis's house, shall we? My goodness. This is actually Louis's bedroom. He brought in ostrich feathers from somewhere that has ostriches. Look at the frescoes on the ceiling and all the gold accents, showing off his wealth. These are just some examples of Baroque architecture as you drive around Paris. Again, notice the detail and the gold accent. All right, our second building for this era is the Palace at Versailles. Now, if you remember, Louis XIV said, the one in Paris isn't good enough. It was good enough for his ancestor, but not for him. So he had this built about 15 miles outside in Versailles. And this is kind of the most famous as far as France goes for this particular style. Notice how we're adding gold accents on the outside, all of this detail. This is very much Baroque in its style. All the gold, and notice the symbol of the sun for the Sun King everywhere. This is where they held all of their parties and their dances out here in the courtyard. Now notice this is one of the rooms from Louis XIV's palace. Notice the gold accents, incredible detail. Also notice that they didn't paint the walls quite yet. So what they did is they actually hung cloth. And in the summer, they would hang cotton because it was cooler. In the winter, they would hang something like velvet because it tended to keep it warmer and insulate the rooms a little bit. Solid gold cabinet, frescoes. And who do you suppose this is here? Posed as a Greek god, basically. Of course, Louis XIV. He has pictures and statues of him all over this place, and he makes himself look like, of course, the sun god Apollo. Another example of Louis and the gold accents. This is actually the chapel inside there. This is famous for Marie Antoinette's wedding. This is where they were married. And depending on what level you were, determined whether you were on the upper level or lower level. So during the wedding, the royal family was down here, and then the rest were up above. But then during regular chapel, the royals would be up here, and then the rest of the nobles would be down below, usually. This is probably the most famous room. I mentioned it earlier. This is the Hall of Mirrors. Now, it's famous for a couple of different reasons. First of all, each panel that you see up here on the ceiling shows a part of Louis XIV's accomplishments. It's basically like a museum to his glory. So talk about a guy that was all about himself. You see these beautiful mirrors here? He's showing off his wealth, but not only that, these were all secret doorways to bedrooms. Yeah, remember Louis XIV was known for his mistresses? Well, this is that place. He had mistresses behind all of those lovely doors. Boy, if we could watch and go back in time, I'm sure there were a lot of tiptoeing women down that hallway for sure. And of course, the queen had a separate bedroom. The king determined when they slept together and when they didn't, usually. This is also famous because this is where the Treaty of Versailles was signed at the end of World War I. So when you study World War I in American history, you'll say, oh yeah, I know why it's called Treaty of Versailles, because it was signed at Versailles Palace. Again, notice all the chandeliers. When we visited here, they said there's about a third of the windows and mirrors and chandeliers that are still the originals from when it was built. Pretty amazing. This is the backyard. Can you imagine? In the Hall of Mirrors, this is what you would see out of those windows. Absolutely fabulous. And it goes all the way back to here. It did not have a river nearby, but the king and queen wanted a little waterway where they could go boating and have a picnic. So they actually have the first example of underground plumbing. And they brought this water with tubing all the way from the river to here so that they could have water and also have water in their fountains. So sometimes the fountains are on when you visit, and sometimes they aren't. They're very old, but they're absolutely gorgeous. Now on each side, there are mazes, kind of like in Harry Potter, and there's all this shrubbery, and honestly, you can get lost. I've been there 3 times, and I've been determined to finish one side. So I've only been to this side. I haven't been to this side yet, but I'm working on it, and there's all kinds of neat stuff that you'll find in there. Here's a little bit of the map. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about, all these little walkways and little statues and fountains outside there. Here's some of the things that you'll find. Let's take a look at this wealth. Now, as you look at this, think about how much money it took to do all of this. And then remember that people in France ended up starving, and they had no bread during Marie Antoinette's era. Helps you understand why they come after the king and queen and eventually cut off their heads, right? Here's some other examples of things in Paris from this era. This is Les Invalides. It was actually built by Louis XIV, and we can tell because of the suns out on the front here. It was actually built for his soldiers when they came home. It was a VA hospital, and it still is today, believe it or not. Now, if you look at the back side, you'll see that here, let me go back. You'll see that there's a point back here. This chapel is actually attached to the hospital, and that is a very Baroque style. There you go. Notice the gold on the dome. That's a very Baroque style for sure. An example of Baroque architecture. This is where Napoleon's body, his tomb, is located, and you can visit there for free, actually, if you ever go to Paris. So it's kind of a neat thing to see. If you want to see all the other stuff, like his uniform and his weapons, then you pay a small fee, but to go and visit his tomb is open to the public. Here's some other examples of different Baroque architecture. Notice how we have kind of these square-looking tops. It's very much a Baroque style. We've got statues everywhere. Lots of detail. Lots and lots of detail and lots of windows. Here's another example of just a simple government building. But if you look closely, take a look at what's on the front of those windows and doors. We see the Sun King. So it shows that this represented his era because the Sun King was around during that era. The Paris Opera House by Charles Garnier is a great example of Baroque architecture. Look at all this detail and all the gold. Boy, oh boy, something to see on the inside as well. Look at this. So much money to build something like this. Okay, a couple of examples of front of chapels, altars, you might say. This one was done by Bernini, a really famous architect from this era. Notice he's using the different colors that are kind of gaudy. Maybe don't always go together. We've got maroon and periwinkle and gold. We've got a lot of gold, a lot of detail going on. Here's another example done by Bernini. Notice he's using all these different colored marble, as well as the gold again. Okay, so now we're going to get into Russia. I know some of you are going to be doing your raps or your poems about Peter the Great, maybe. This is his home. But remember, Peter the Great, he went and he visited Versailles Palace and Louis XIV. And he saw what Louis did at Versailles, and he's like, I want one. No, I want to outdo him. So I want two. So he built two of them. This one is actually called the Russian Versailles because it is so similar to Versailles Palace in France. This is his summer residence, which makes sense. It would be yellow then. Notice we now have color on the outside. Notice all the gold accents. Absolutely beautiful. So much wealth. And again, remember, the Russian Revolution ends up happening and eventually they're killed as well. But notice all the money that goes into this. Of course, this is a copy of what room? The Hall of Mirrors. Very good. Look at all the detail. And notice he's trying to outdo what they did in France. The gold on just this wall is probably enough to feed the whole country of Russia, if you can imagine. Now look at the backyard and see the similarities between Versailles in France and what you see here. Isn't that interesting? He's got the walkways on the outside, the fountains. The only thing he doesn't have is the waterway down here. Okay, so I told you he built two. This is his winter residence. It is now called the Hermitage Museum. Some of you might recognize that. When you did your art replica, some of you maybe said that your art was held in the Hermitage. That's this place right here. It is held in St. Petersburg, named after Peter the Great, of course. And this was his residence in the winter. Notice that it's green in color. Again, notice all the gold accents. And we're like outdoing each other. One step more, and we're adding more and more to it. More money as well. Look at that detail. Very Russian style and yet very Baroque. That's what it looks like at night. Isn't that gorgeous? Can you imagine a solid gold chariot carrying you around town? My goodness. This would, of course, be his Hall of Mirrors here, only this time he added gold pillars. All right, so some of you remember the name Catherine the Great, maybe? She took over later after Peter and decided that his places weren't good enough, so she built her own place as well. This is Catherine's Palace. It is also in St. Petersburg. I have never been to Russia, but because of this class, I now want to go and visit these places, something terrible. They're just absolutely beautiful. Again, she did hers in blue, and notice, of course, all the gold accents. She's going to try to outdo her predecessor. She used 100 kilograms of gold on just the exterior. Wow. A little bit gaudy, just maybe. My goodness. So remember that this country's been through World War II, right? So what happened is when the Germans went into Russia, they basically took over all this territory and they destroyed a lot of it. They basically tore everything out of this palace and just like dumped all over it. So after they were removed out of their country, the Russians rebuilt this. Took millions of dollars, but they did, and it's absolutely beautiful. Now the story goes, I've seen pictures, that there's a fourth palace and it's pink. And it's supposed to even outdo this one. But when the Germans took over, they not only stole everything and took everything out of it, but they also buried their dead out in the gardens. So for them to renovate that, it's going to take millions of dollars because they also need to be respectful for the bodies that are buried there. So I hope that someday we'll be able to see that. Take a look at this detail. The sum of 1,600,000 rubles was spent on the reconstruction of the interior alone. It's been torn down to its foundation at least 6 times in its history, and that does not include the amount of money that the Queen has personally contributed to this building. So it's quite an amazing building, and hopefully we get to see it someday. All right, guys, that's it for architecture and art for chapter 7, and so have a great day.